So we're very happy to have Edwin Chan tonight from EC3. Edwin, let me do a brief introduction. Edwin Chan received his Bachelor of Arts from the College of Environmental Design at UC Berkeley and Master of Architecture from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. After graduation, Edwin joined Frank Gehry's office and worked there for 25 years. During that time, Edwin has collaborated with Mr. Gehry as a design partner on many of the firm's most significant cultural and institutional projects, including Opus Residential Tower in Hong Kong, Novartis International in Basel, Switzerland, Foundation Louis Vuitton in Paris, and the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain, which, by the way, marks its 20th anniversary this year. In 2013, Edwin launched his independent architectural design studio, EC3. Based in Los Angeles, EC3 is founded on the principle to empower cross-disciplinary collaboration in creativity and embraces a vision for professional practice that transcends culture and geography. Edwin Chan's experience overseeing the design and construction of more than 3 million square feet of cultural, institutional, workplace, urban design, and residential projects informs EC3's design approach to balance the practical and theoretical considerations of implementing projects worldwide. For our lecture series, which is titled Emerging Practice, it is super interesting to hear about his transition, bringing years of experience designing iconic, high-profile, and often large-scale projects around the world to establishing a startup practice operating at a different scale, budget, and office and infrastructure. We're excited to hear about his new explorations. Please welcome Edwin Chan.
Thank you, Yasushi, for the interview. I thought you were going to talk about your interview. Anyways, I'm excited to be here tonight at Woodbury, so hopefully this is going to be as interesting for you as it is for me. As Yasushi pointed out, I was at Frank's office for over 25 years. It was a long time, but if I would like to start from the very beginning, when I graduated from Harvard many years ago, I was confronted with the same dilemma, probably, that all you architecture students will have to confront, which is, who do I want to work for? So at that time, I figured there were 3 architects in the world that I was interested in working for. I won't name names specifically, but the first architect was a professor of mine at the GSD. He had an office in New York. And then I figure, I love his work, and especially his theoretical writings, but then I figured that I already had him as my professor, so it wouldn't really make sense for me to move to New York and continue this relationship with him. The second architect I was very interested in, and still am very interested in, is a European architect. At the time, he had just started his practice in Rotterdam, and I figured, I don't really want to move to Rotterdam. It rains there all the time, and the food is not very good. So I sort of nixed that idea. The third architect is Frank. Now, I've always wanted to move to Los Angeles because it's supposedly always sunny here. But at that time, obviously, Frank was still doing small-scale residential projects. However, what drew me to Frank was his relationship with the artists, and that's very important. I figured I could learn a lot about working with the artists and practicing architecture as it relates to the art by working with Frank. So I applied to his office, and I was very fortunate. I was hired, and we started working on these projects together. Yeah, so over the course of 25 years, we worked on a lot of quote-unquote cultural projects, and here are just a few of them. So this one here is the University of Minnesota Art Museum, Weizmann Art Museum. This one here, the American Center in Paris. This is the Herford Museum in Germany. And of course, this is the most famous one, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, that will celebrate its 20th anniversary next month. Oh, actually, it's this month. Time flies, it's October. In any case, so my last project at Frank's office is the Foundation Louis Vuitton. I've always considered this to be my, say, postgraduate thesis. I figured this would be a high point in my practice at Frank's office. So to tell you a little bit about this project, it's located in Paris, and for those of you who are familiar with Paris, this is the Louvre here, and this is the Champs-Élysées. As you can see, the site of the Foundation Louis Vuitton is unique in the sense that it's located in a park that is called the Bois de Boulogne. For those of you guys who play tennis, you know the French Open. It's over there every year. And at the northern end of the Bois de Boulogne, there is a small children's park. It's called the Jardin d'Acclimatation, which is a very famous, very important place, special place for kids. And that's where the foundation is located. Now, like all museum projects, this project has, I think, a very interesting challenge. Number one, if you were to put the museum program onto the site and lay it out like this, the museum requires an enclosed environment, white walls, and climate control. So it would be a one-story warehouse, kind of like this, sitting in the park. It's like a rental piano building, if you will. However, the fact that it's in a beautiful children's park suggests that it wants to be fairly transparent, because when you're inside the building, you actually want to enjoy the nature around it. So those two demands are contradictory to each other. And it took us a long time to try to come up with a resolution that would satisfy both the museum's demand to have an enclosed environment, the galleries, and its public demand to have transparency. So we made a lot of study models to show to the client. So every time we go to Paris, we bring all these models and show it to them. And being French, they're very picky about all this. And slowly, after a process of 6 months, we finally arrive at a solution that seems to be pretty simple when you look back at it. So if you think about the program, the galleries could be organized like these little wood blocks, and each one is rectilinear and fairly rational. And between the galleries, they could be connected by bridges, so when you go from one gallery to another, you have a glimpse of the outside. You get to experience the exterior when you move through the museum. Now, of course, like all museums, it's a multi-story building, so by elevating some of these galleries on pedestals, we also create a space underneath here that could be used for temporary exhibitions, and it also allows natural light potentially to reach the bottom part of the massing. And you could see here, so that as the visitor moves through the museum, through these ramps, and the natural lights come down, it becomes like a children's kind of building block, kind of like this. And the requirement in order to fit all the program into the massing envelope, we also have to go underground. So to make the subterranean spaces more appealing, we decided to create also a moat, like water, around the building, so that the spaces underground could look out and there's water around the building. So the building also appears to be like a boat. And it also speaks to like the Parisian kind of environment where the river kind of runs through the city. Now then, of course, the weather in Paris is not always sunny like Los Angeles, so we figured that some of these spaces could be covered by a glass kind of canopy. So by enclosing the building with glass, you also make some of these outdoor terraces habitable in the rainy days of Paris. So then if you put these together, you get a building in a very rough massing that kind of looks like this, with outdoor terraces on the roof and these rectilinear kind of these building block galleries kind of supported in a very sculptural way inside with bridges and elevators and escalators that connect all of them. We work very closely with the curators at the foundation to establish the exhibition program. So we decided that there would be 3 types of gallery spaces in the building. One is these kind of what we call the classical galleries, skylights, white walls, conventional galleries, central light, diffused. And then there might be some galleries in the building that would be dedicated to, there would be a little bit more sculptural, that living artists could do interventions. Louis Vuitton works with the Japanese artist Murakami quite a bit. So we made this model and asked Murakami to install some of his art in it to see if it actually works. And he did a pretty good job about kind of installing this. So these galleries are meant for collaboration with artists. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's a temporary exhibition gallery at the bottom of the building. So it's a big, flexible space for installation that could also be transformed into like fashion shows when it's required. The client likes to do that, obviously. So then when you put all of them together, you get a building that looks like this. First of all, you have the gallery spaces, as I described to you, very rational spaces that are supported in a very 3-dimensional way with ramps and escalators connecting them like this. And then, but then the question is, where is the architecture when you do something like this? Of course, if you put a skin, a cladding, around all the circulation spaces, it creates an opportunity for the public spaces to have a very sculptural feel, so that you see some of these surfaces that are kind of enclosing the bridges and the escalators. In the public spaces where there's not art, you create these kind of, a very kind of sculptural looking exterior when you can still enter the interior of the galleries and maintain them as being very rational. And then, of course, when you put the glass enclosure around this and make the glass enclosure fit like a glove around this, you get this kind of a look that is like a sailboat, so to speak. We call it the iceberg because it kind of looks like an iceberg to us, not necessarily by metaphor, just free association. Here, then, we have the glass sails around the iceberg. So this building is essentially a very rational core, very sculptural circulation public spaces enclosed by very sculptural glass enclosures. It's 3 buildings in 1, so to speak. And then we figure by enclosing the building with glass, you could also be an opportunity for artists, especially video artists, to do projections on the building so that all year round there's an opportunity for the building to have a very ephemeral light appearance, especially when it appears in the park. Now, how does one make a building that looks kind of like this real, constructible, and feasible in terms of budget and technology? So of course you've heard of our computer program that we put. So this is a 3-dimensional CATIA program of our design model. And then using our computer technology, we're able to rationalize a lot of the very complicated parts. So for example, this is, I won't go into this in detail, but you could see this is, of course, an analysis of a skin of a complex iceberg shape. And using the computer program, we could rationalize it into repetitive panels that could be used for cladding the iceberg, so to speak. Similarly, the glass, you think that this is all curved glass, but in fact, by analyzing the curvature of the glass, we could actually use repetitive glass, no custom bend glass. So that makes it financially feasible. Again here, some more analysis of the surfaces. What appears to be complex, using computer, we could make them all very feasible. Like the color here is the Gaussian analysis of the glass surfaces. That means that, for example, ideally, if you input the data from the curvature of the surfaces, you want all of the color to become blue. So in this picture here, you see blue surfaces, meaning the glass could be bent without custom fabrication. The red meaning that they're problematic, and we could work on these glass until the idea is that the whole computer model could become blue, so that you can actually make all these complex glass shapes without custom bending the glass. You could see actually glass is quite a giving structure. This is just, you can see these guys holding a piece of glass, and you can ever bend it ever so slightly. And it's actually very strong. You see these guys actually standing on it. And none of this is done with custom bending. In fact, it's just a piece of natural glass. So by using the computer in this way, we could actually create quite complex and sculptural shapes. Now, the structure of the building, again, you could see because the building is situated in a park, we thought that it would be nice for the structure to have, like some of the structure to be made with wood, so that it speaks and connect with the natural surrounding. However, where it's necessary, we use steel. So the structure supporting the glass canopy is really a combination of wooden structure and glass, and steel structure. Of course, the people building it, we use like mountaineering technology, but everybody seemed to enjoy doing this. This is what it looks like in the Parisian skyline. I think the building opened in 2014, so it's been 3 years now, I think. And it's holding up really well. In the last few years, it's had a number of different exhibition programs. And it's all been very successful, I'm happy to say. Now, of course, I'm not able to bring you there, so in lieu of that, I've sort of put together a video, which is performed, the dance performed by an artist, Blvd, so you could see what the interior of the building looks like with the galleries.
I was born in Chicago, raised in Memphis, Tennessee. Didn't start dancing until I was like 11 years old. The dance style I do, it's a dance style that started with Memphis underground rap music. And that music, the way it was produced, gave us a certain bounce. When I was around 16 years old, I got into ballet. We made a deal with this artistic director. We would teach hip hop, and then they would teach us some ballet, and that's how it happened. As performing artists and as dancers, we see everything as art.
I wish I could move like that. But I think it's, I like this video because I think very much so architecture, it embodies a sense of movement. And in that sense, a museum, I think there is a mythology out there that is the museum needs to be neutral. And I believe that as much as it's probably better to describe it or characterize it as the museum should be a place where the art and the architecture should come together. They should complement each other. And the museum itself being a neutral white box may or may not be the best way to achieve this goal. And so far, the artists have responded very positively to spaces that are not necessarily neutral because it actually gives them something to respond to. And it's something that you should kind of think about because I think the idea of a neutral space for art is not necessarily the best way to celebrate what artists could do. In any case, so after Louis Vuitton, I figured, maybe it's time for me to move on. So in 2013, I thought that it's time for me to kind of start my own adventure. So I started my own practice. The question is, what does one do after 25 years of working at Frank's office and with the Louis Vuitton Foundation as my last project there? I figured then perhaps it would be useful. It's kind of a dilemma because on the one hand, I have all that experience behind me, but then at the same time, my office is a startup. So it's a very unique situation that I had to confront. So I figured, perhaps one way to address this is sort of going back to basic and start to look back into my experience of all these projects and ask myself, well, what are the most important things that I've learned from the experience? And in some ways, I can narrow it down to, say, 3 kind of takeaways that I thought I would share with you. And that's actually the reason why I call this lecture Simple Measures, because those are actually very, very simple things. Number one of the things that I really, really enjoy, that I've learned the most from Frank's office, is a lot of people would think it's probably some kind of architectural style. Like you learn how to do these curvy buildings or something like that. And in fact, I think more importantly, it's an idea about collaboration in the sense that Frank has been a great collaborator. I've learned a lot about collaboration with him, but also collaborating with artists and with other people, and also with clients is a very important part of the making successful building. And I think a lot of the projects that we've worked on are collaboration with clients, with artists, and with other people. So that's something that I'm definitely very interested in continuing in my practice, and it's become a very central part of my practice. And the second thing is, while I was very lucky at Frank's office to have worked on a lot of these so-called high-profile projects, iconic projects, I also thought that there are more to architecture than making these kind of standalone museum projects. I wanted to have more opportunity to explore perhaps urban projects or projects with a strong landscape components to it. So I wanted my practice to be more cross-disciplinary, if you will, from that point of view. And then the third part is in terms of process. I think that working hand in hand, hands-on is a very important part of the process in the sense that especially now with the advanced technology, we tend to lose touch with the kind of tactile aspect of our experience. So in my practice, I'm still staying on fairly kind of old school hands-on physical modeling and using technology as we know how to do, like at the Foundation Louis Vuitton, as a way to execute the building as opposed to using it as a way of finding form. And I think the human scale and the human experience is central to this aspect of the practice, and is something that I value a lot as I sort of work on my own projects. So using those 3 principles, we are able to continue we're working on a series of new projects. And the first project that I worked on is a very, very small interior space in Hollywood. You guys may know this project a little bit because it's actually located next to the Woodbury Gallery in Hollywood, in Lace. And it came to me in a very unexpected way through my artist friend, Piero Golia. That would be him. I met Piero about maybe 10 years ago, perhaps. And he was showing at the LA Art Fair at the time. And I was introduced to him through the art critic Hans-Ulrich Obrich. And he said, Edwin, you have to go meet Piero. He had just crushed his van. And apparently the crushed van was an art piece that he had just performed at the art fair. So I went over to his crushed van, but I didn't see any Piero. So I left him a note. And I said, you know, Hans-Ulrich told me that I should meet you. So, and I left. Then a few days later, Piero wrote back an email and had said, yeah, he had just at the time started a school, an art school called Mountain School of Art. And it's for artists who are interested in pursuing a kind of research, continuing education kind of thing. And he invited me to go give a lecture at the Mountain School. So I did. And then after that, we became good friends. So then when I first started EC3, Piero said, well, he has this idea. He wants to make this club, and it's called the Chalet. And I asked him, well, why do you call it the Chalet? And he said, well, you know, it's a kind of a communal space. And it's interesting that it came from an artist like Piero because typically, like what I was saying earlier, art is hung in a gallery space. And Piero and a bunch of his friends have decided that they wanted to create an alternative experience. So he put together his friends, and one of it is the painter Marc Grosjean. The other one is the French artist Pierre Weed. And they all came together and tried to create work for this space. And it's supposed to be a social space that is not neutral and is a complete immersive art architectural experience. So when Piero explained this to me, I said, oh, okay, that's a great idea. Number one, I needed to do a project. And second, I like what you're saying. Plus third, it could become a cultural community for Los Angeles. So it's all good. So this is the exterior of the building. You may recognize this. Now inside Lace at the time, they have very generously offered us the back of house spaces. So if you look at the spaces, you may remember this is the hallway in the back. And there are these rooms that are sort of compartmentalized. So it became very clear to me that each one of these artists should have a space, but all the compartmentalized spaces, so I put Marc Grosjean here in this room in the front, and then Pierre Weed would have this room here, and then there's this hallway that connects to the front of house. And the hallway, I figured that could be where the architecture is, so to speak. Now, because the spaces are quite small, I figure it's also important that we have sort of visual connections. So I kind of punch an opening here between the two rooms, while at the same time allowing each artist and their space to have a certain kind of autonomy. So working with Pierre, at the time he was interested in making these aquariums, and he's designed an aquarium specifically for the Chalet. But then, I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, but the most time his aquariums, he had a show at LACMA a couple of years ago. I don't know whether you guys have been to this show or not. But in a gallery setting, the aquarium would be sitting on a white pedestal, so to speak. But Pierre said to me, well, that was all good for the galleries, but for the Chalet, what he really wanted to do is to create an ambiance so that the aquariums is in the middle where you can orchestrate and organize, and people can kind of hang out around it. So I built this physical model, and we worked very closely with Pierre to organize the spaces So he had put the aquarium in the middle, and we organized all the seating around the aquarium, and slowly we kind of create an organization that is kind of like this. And he likes the aquarium being an integral part of the social experience, so to speak. And this is kind of like a study model of the space, the aquarium in the middle with all the seating around. And this is what the room kind of looks like when it's finished. I've sort of used like a green plywood for the cladding of the wall as a way to complement the kind of underwater theme that he was doing. And this is like a floating rock. So in an aquarium, this is really a rock floating. And inside here, Pierre has created this kind of ecosystem with hermit crabs and all that stuff here. So it's really a living organism that is in a sort of very, a kind of social environment like this. The second artist we work with very closely is the painter Mark Rojan. As you can see, Mark is kind of like a macho guy. And when I first showed him the design model, in the room, he looked at it for a minute, and he started to sketch directly on the model. And these sketches Mark made specifically on this design model that eventually became the space. And he painted these as an inspiration, as a response to my physical design model. And this is kind of what his space looked like. I mentioned to you that I made an opening here so that Grosjean's room and Pierre-Louis' room could have this kind of visual connection, but also at the same time allowing each room to be somewhat autonomous. Now, of course, why is it called a chalet? It wouldn't be a chalet without wood. But where does the wood come from? So we looked all the way everywhere around Los Angeles to see if we can find a kind of wood that we would work for the chalet. And also, because the chalet is only meant to be some kind of a temporary installation, we have to kind of figure out a modular way of making the space. So we found a white oak forest in Pennsylvania, and we decided to repurpose the white oak forest. So we kind of cut the wood in a sort of a series of modular ways like this, and had them shipped to Hollywood, and then we reassembled them into an environment like this. At the club, we also created these custom designed locker cabinets so that the members of the club could put their little alcohols in there as a way of whenever things are happening. And also, we've also custom designed these chandeliers for the space. So when the club is happening, it kind of creates this environment that is a social environment and transform this very long corridor into a kind of different experience. So when the club happens, we obviously invited different kinds of people from the art world, and different people came. And also there's a piano that was given to us by the conceptual artist Christopher Williams. And this piano supposedly was at once from the Düsseldorf School of Art, and it was once played by Joseph Beuys, a famous German artist also. In any case, so it's become an extremely successful experience. This is an image of, he's the dancer, Stephen Galloway. I don't know if you know him. He's a very famous choreographer, and he's choreographed some dance and a series of performances in the space as well. So the point is that by making the art and the architecture a complete unity, we've also kind of created opportunities for artists and people in the artistic community to engage the space and the experience in a very positive way. But I think part of the charm of the chalet is also the fact that from the exterior, it's just warehouse, as you probably know, and it's like you have to go through the threshold of this door to kind of discover the space. After 1 year in this space, we kind of disassembled the chalet, and it's sort of, we put it in container, and it's waiting for its next incarnation, which I will share with you a little bit later. My second experience project after I started my practice is a project in Bogota, Colombia. And it came about in the most unusual way. So one day I was, Sunday afternoon, I was driving on the 10th and my cell phone rang. And impulsively, I just kind of picked up the phone, and there's this guy on the other side that says, my name is Kevin Shella, and I'm calling you from Bogota, Colombia. I need you to do something for me. And at that time, I thought, well, why is he calling me from Colombia? It must be some kind of drug thing that he wanted me to do. So I wasn't sure, plus I don't know the guy. And I said, well, you know, I'm driving on the freeway. Can you call me back tomorrow during office hour? And I hung up. So then, indeed, he called me back the next day, and he said, well, it turned out that the year before, I had given a lecture at Bogota, Colombia, to their kind of AIA, so to speak. And Kevin was not at the lecture, but it turned out that his company was one of the sponsors for the lecture series. So indirectly, he heard about my lecture, and he thought that he wanted to work with me. Don't know why. But in any case, so I talked to him a little bit, and he said, well, he's got this piece of property, which is at the corner of a very lively intersection in Bogota. And he wanted me to consider working with him for a new building to develop this little corner property. So I flew down to Bogota, and I worked with him, and this is Kevin, and this is his partner, Santiago. You can see they're young and entrepreneurial. And we started talking about the project, and when you work on a project in Bogota, you drink a lot of alcohol. And that's what we kind of consumed during our work session. And intuitively, we just started making stuff. So this is like my first massing model for his project. So, but basically my point is this. If you look at the site, which you did earlier, you notice that there are a lot of buildings around the site. If you were to make a new building, which is this part here, the majority of the units from the new development would be looking at not so pretty buildings across the street, so to speak. So the question becomes, from a development point of view, how does one make this building or the units in this building desirable and viable? So then Kevin came to LA and we started working on the massing models. So as you can see, I actually make my clients make models and they seem to like it. If they can't pass the model making test, they can't really be my client. So here they are. So Kevin is working with me on this model, and basically we came up with this idea just out of the blue. And I said, look, you know, there are some units in your buildings that are good. They're facing the main street. You can get natural light. But then there are some there's some units in the building in the back that are not going to be very good units. And because they look outside and you're going to be looking at the neighbors like 10 feet away, so it really wouldn't make any sense. And I just said, well, if I were you, I would consider getting rid of those units altogether. So then we created a massing that is somewhat like this. Now, in a conventional developer logic, it would make absolutely no sense because a conventional developer would want you to maximize the building envelope. So then Kevin said, well, let me think about this. So we left, and I figured, okay, the next day he's going to fire me and it'll be fine because, you know, obviously it makes no common sense from a financial point of view. And then the next morning, he came back and he said, well, I figured it out. He said, basically, if you develop this space that we kind of took out all the units and you make it into a public space, an event space, he can probably make more money renting that space as event space than leasing these units as bad apartments or bad office spaces. So in the end, the financial model might make more sense for him. So this is just a really rough massing model that we made of the massing of the building. So these units on the top, they would be spectacular because you will have the view and the light. The bad units down here were taken out, but instead we kind of made an urban room down here, so to speak, and he could rent this as an event space. And by making this a special space, it also gives the rest of the building a certain kind of cachet, so to speak, and add the rent. And when you put up all the areas, I mean, I won't go into the area calculation, but in the end, you know, we haven't lost that much area in relationship to his allowable floor area ratio. But by creating this, the revenue that this can potentially generate for him would be exponentially higher than just building this out as bad residential units. Now, if you look at the image earlier that I showed you about Bogota, you see that the majority of the city is essentially a very heavy city with a lot of brick, red brick. So it's a little bit like Boston, if you will. It's very heavy. But what makes the city beautiful is the green hills around it. So majority, if you were to want to be contextual in a conventional way, you might consider making the massing of this building in brick. And that's kind of what this would look like. It could be a brick kind of cubic form that sits on top of a fairly transparent lobby space, so to speak. Now, on the other hand, I think what struck me from my trip to Bogota is that because it's located in the tropics, and also with the green hills that surrounds the city, it rains a lot, actually every afternoon, but in a sort of tropical way, so it rains for about half an hour and then it's sunny. So the sky is very dramatic, and I figure it might be interesting to create a building that is that responds as opposed to the brick building that surrounds it to the sky and the natural environment. So we looked at a model that is kind of a glass building that reflects the sky and the environment. And this is kind of what the first idea of the exterior of the building might look like. And I was kind of excited about it by exploring like a building that is dematerializing and is very light in contrast to the very heavy contextual environment that somehow plays with the color and the light of the sky. However, there's good news and bad news. The zoning law in Bogota changed earlier this year, and instead of a 10-story, 11-story building like the massing that I showed you earlier, now we're able to make a 22-level building. So all of a sudden the massing kind of changed. So we had to start from scratch again, and this is sort of where the massing of the building looks like. And I figure, you know, since Kevin liked the public space, the event space that we created in the first one, perhaps we could make two of them in the vertical building. So this is sort of our first massing idea for the building, which is like these blocks that are kind of exploded axonometric or something like that. However, this is still at the very early stage. We're just starting to look at this, and hopefully in the future I will be able to share with you how this evolved and developed. The second project is in the city of Istanbul. When I was a student at Harvard, I actually spent a summer in Turkey in an archaeological dig. They have a kind of summer program that allows students to work in an archaeological dig, and I was living out my Indiana Jones dream. So, but because of that, I've gotten to know Turkey extremely well, and Istanbul is one of my favorite cities in terms of where I've been in the world. Obviously, as you know, it's strategically located between Asia and Europe, so culturally and historically is incredibly rich. There is this site. This is the Golden Horn, a very important waterway in Istanbul. And this bridge, just to orient yourself, for those of you, this is called the Galata Bridge. Of course, in the distance, you see the Hagia Sophia, and then there's the Blue Mosque. It's one of the world's most unique skyline. There is a site by the Golden Horn, like right there. And right now, it's a big hole that's empty, it's a void. And it could become potentially a main image main welcoming image for the city of Istanbul. So here's the site here. Now the problem is to bring the pedestrian. This is at the edge of a very historic residential commercial neighborhood on the other side, and to get the pedestrian, but there's no way of getting the pedestrian across to the waterway, because there's this very busy street that bisects the site and the connection to the water. And you can also see that along this waterway is a major transportation hub. It's like crazy traffic. You think traffic in LA is bad, just that you see this stuff. It's taxis and water taxis and buses and trains and everything. But it's a very, you could see it's a very lively urban context, and with a void in the middle that requires some attention. So to make that connection, the city's idea would be to make an underground connection from the site to the water. But as you imagine, in Istanbul, if you start digging underground, you may dig up all kinds of archaeological stuff. So from our point of view, it's not necessarily the best way to make the urban connection. And so therefore, the city organized an international competition for how to make the connection to Istanbul. And I was teamed up with a young colleague of mine, Casey, you know who that is, to kind of try to find an alternative solution to this problem. So we studied different ways of making connection, like bridges, plazas, and multiple bridges, and the solution seems to be actually quite simple. As opposed to going underground, which would be costly and time-consuming and technologically complicated, we thought that we should just build a deck that extends across over the road, and on top of the deck, you can make a park, so that the connection from this complex, the urban texture, through the park to the other side would be effortless. And it would be actually much cheaper, and the park could become an amenity to the community. I mean, of course, this is a very preliminary notion of that, but it's about creating a sequence of small spaces. So it's not like a grand gesture like in the kind of urban axial planning way that they would do it, but it's about filtering the pedestrians through a series of small spaces onto this park and then opening back out to the water about this very busy traffic way. So we presented this to the competition, and we were one of the 7 teams that were allowed to kind of proceed with this. But of course, politics have a way of getting in the way, so the project was not allowed to move on just because of the political situation in Turkey, I'm sure you know. But nevertheless, we thought that this is an interesting idea for redesigning or reorganizing the waterfront, and I'm hoping that, of course, I consider this to be an incomplete project in a way, but I think it's an interesting experience, and I hope that some of these ideas that we generated from the competition we could apply to other situations in the future. And then we move on to Dallas. I've been to Dallas I've been to Texas, but Dallas is actually a new experience. Next. And I was contacted by these people. It's called the Schraman Foundation. And one thing that I didn't realize was that Dallas, over the last 10, 20 years, have accumulated, has grown quite a large number of South Indian population. I think it's because of the technologies over there. And the client at the time, he's a gentleman by the name of Dr. Jain, and he's sort of made a fortune with pharmaceutical industries. And he wanted to create a museum, a foundation for the South Indian population in Dallas. Very interesting project. And also, he has acquired a site near downtown Dallas. It's a huge vacant lot that is also very close. If you know Dallas, this is the Arts District over here. So it's very close, within walking distance at the border of the Arts District. And it's also across the street from the Science Museum designed by Morphosis. You can see it kind of here, it's Tom's building. So our site gets to it's bisected by a freeway. So this is kind of what the site kind of looks like at the moment. It's like empty lot, huge, and surrounded by these kind of skyscrapers. And this picture is actually taken from the Morphosis building, looking at our site. Of course, like when you think about a South Asian Indian cultural center, one of the things that we looked at very quickly, the challenge is how does one make an Indian or South Asian cultural center that is rooted in their culture, but at the same time not trying to kind of copy literally the architectural motif. But I think there are certain things about the value of the kind of architecture that is important to us. One is, of course, the relationship to landscape, the architectural quality of the landscape and the integration with the landscape at the building is important. The bold massing of the architecture, there's a quality about the way the massing of the buildings are, but also there's a kind of porosity with the arcades, and this is actually an image of an Indian step well. You guys know that in India, they have to build these step wells to collect water. So these becomes an important kind of inspiration for us as we try to reinterpret South Asian architecture for a contemporary audience. Since I didn't know that much about landscape, I sort of I solicited the help of a landscape architectural firm in Boston called Reed Hildebrand. And they very kindly agreed to collaborate with me. And Reed Hildebrand has done some very exquisite landscape designs all over the country. And I think one of the most famous one is the Clark Art Institute. But very specifically, their approach to landscape I resonate with is about creating kind of landscape as a background or as a kind of that complements the art. So it's a good partner for us to embark on this project. So we asked ourselves, what would you do with such a huge site? So the first thing that we did is that we kind of laid out their program. Once again, like we imagined, what if you make all the program on the site as a one-story building? And the building and the project is sort of divided up into these different components. There's the foundation itself, which is the museum, and then there's a think tank. So we laid out all these different things on the site, not necessarily in this adjacency, but just to help us visualize what it would be if you put it on the site. And then we also worked with Reed Hildebrand to have a better understanding of the connection of the site to its surroundings. I mean, you could see this diagram. Dallas has no shortage of cultural institutions. There's a lot of parking spaces around the building. The site obviously is an important part of an urban connector. And of course, the green spaces, how the project can address all of these issues. Number one. So now, without knowing any better, we just have to create a lot of different schemes. Tonight, I wouldn't be able to go through every single one of these with you, but basically the different scenarios to help our client visualize what it would mean to organize a museum on the site like that. And then those schemes are then reorganized into some very basic approaches. We gave them an idea that perhaps the foundation of their project could be organized like a campus. It could be a single building. It could have multiple courtyards, or it could be a series of interlocking arcades like a conventional, like in the old days of Indian architecture. And we also work with our clients to help them kind of evaluate each one of these schemes with different kind of criteria, like iconic qualities, outdoor spaces, urban connections, how open is the building, but also for them phasing and feasibility is important. The ease of operation is important, and then there's the unspeakable one at the very bottom that we don't always like to talk about. But in any ways, we kind of help them create this matrix, and it's a way to objectify the schemes for them and help them kind of vote which one is the winner. And the winner is a scheme A3, which is a kind of a spiral type of scheme with the ground level that is very open, and it's kind of tied in with an extensive outdoor landscape treatment, which I will show you in a second. So organizationally, the building is organized with public spaces in the bottom, and one kind of ascend this spiral, but it's a rectilinear spiral that goes up with the foundation as it kind of goes up to a think tank, and then eventually at the very top there is a restaurant. So, but each section is kind of discrete, but at the same time connected. It also, the spiral formation also gives them the opportunity to potentially expand, have this kind of infinity suggestion to them. And the spiral form also ties into the treatment of the courtyard with landscape treatments that kind of complement. So it looks like the building rises out of the garden, the landscape on the ground level. In the center is a water feature like a conventional Indian architecture. The water plays an important role. There's also an amphitheater here for outdoor performances. And it kind of looks like that, sort of at the preliminary stage. We went very far in terms of this proposal, and then. But unfortunately, at the end, we were actually very close to the final stage of the design, and then unfortunately, like all things happen, the client called us and they decided to cancel the project for whatever reason. So we were not able to develop it beyond this kind of conceptual phase. But also, I think for me, I like to share this with you because it's an important experience. From our point of view, you have to kind of do a lot of these canceled projects to kind of get to the next one. And hopefully some of these ideas we could apply to the next project. So I mentioned to you the chalet in Los Angeles because it was such a successful thing. I finally get to put it in Dallas. So I get at my Dallas project after all. The National Sculpture Center has decided to transport the chalet to the rental piano building in Dallas. And so but the challenge is really quite different in the sense that you remember in Los Angeles we had these discrete outdoor spaces, but in the rental piano building it's really a very finished gallery. So we have to treat it with respect, and we have to kind of figure out a way to insert all the elements from Los Angeles into Dallas. And this is kind of what it looks like. So instead of the walls that we have in Hollywood, there's no wall here. So I repurpose and reconfigure some of the wood timber elements into these kind of partitions that created more intimate spaces. And then the Pierre Weed Aquarium and the Mark Rochon are opposite two sides of the space with the piano here. It's actually a very intimate setting. It's more open, but at the same time, I think it's actually in some ways more successful. It was in Dallas for 6 months, and somehow I think that it sort of galvanized the artistic community in a different way in Dallas than it is in Los Angeles. And one of the things that I enjoy the most about the installation in Dallas is the fact that because it's in the museum, the chalet also has a presence during the day, and is a much more integral part of the museum's programming. So while it has the evening events like the way it had in Los Angeles, during the day it's a pleasure to see children running through the space and playing with the piano or looking at the aquarium and being marveled by the marine creatures in the aquarium. So it has a completely different light. Also the fact that it's one of the wall here is a glass wall. It also allows natural light to flood the room during the day. So it has a completely different feeling than it was in Hollywood. And also I made a lot of friends while we were in Dallas, and hopefully I've sort of learned about the Dallas community. And I think it's a place that I'm very fond of, and I hope that I will be able to go back to Dallas and do another project. And I like the fact that, we don't have the warehouse to hide it, but in front of the Nasha we have trees, so you have to go through the trees and you kind of discover the chalet, which is very interesting for me. Next, in Hong Kong, earlier this year, I designed a stage set. As I mentioned to you, the cross-disciplinary, working with the art is an important part of my practice. And back in the days, when I was at Frank's office, I was fortunate enough to have worked on 2 operas at the LA Opera. And this is an opera set that we designed. It was called the Ariadne of Naxos. It was an opera by Richard Strauss. So I think that the set design is an interesting part of the practice because it allows you to test out ideas and images and fabrications and making things very quickly. In architecture, it takes years to make a building, but set design, you can kind of do it very quickly. Now, earlier this year, in Hong Kong, I was approached by an artistic director by the name of Vicky Oy to design a set for a new production of Frankenstein. And it was an interesting challenge because, first of all, the production is geared towards children, and it's about designing a production that would entice children's high school students' interest in the performing arts. So I think that's a worthy goal. And also, the budget for this is extremely challenging. It's $25,000. So we have to create something special with a limited budget very quickly. For a very interesting play, iconic play, Frankenstein, geared towards to entice young children and raise their interest in the performing arts. And I figure the way to do this, just a cheap way to do this, is to use scaffolding, because I think in Asia, scaffolding is a very important part of the construction industry and is a very important part of the daily experience of the urban experience. So we created these sets using scaffoldings, and they become a part of the thing. And the other thing that is important is the play itself has 3 scenes. I won't go into the details of the script, but one scene is in the living room where Victor Frankenstein play out his drama with his family. And then, of course, there's the laboratory of his transformation. And then finally, there is a television, a high-tech studio. And because the stage itself is quite small, it became important to me that we thought that we should organize the different scenes in a multi-level set. So we created a multi-level set so that the different scenes could play out within the very constricted floor plates of the stage. So this is kind of 2 scenes that we show you. Like here, this is a television studio happening about the laboratory, contemplating or debating about the future of artificial intelligence. I should mention that this Frankenstein is adapted to the 21st century, so it's a retelling of the classic story in today's audience. And this is, of course, the laboratory. We use a lot of projections and translucent materials, so it's all about using sets that can be built and realized very quickly, using materials and lighting to create the mood for the different scenes. And of course, this is the moment when he became Frankenstein. And then, of course, like this is using light to create this thing so that the entire set is minimal effect and it's kind of dematerialized, but it creates this kind of environment. I think the show was very successful, and it debuted in Hong Kong during the Art Basel Week. And apparently, based on the selfies that I've seen on social media, I think all the kids kind of liked the show. They really enjoyed it, and it's gotten to has pretty good reviews, sold out. So I guess mission accomplished. It's an interesting experience. I love doing sets. I like to do more of that in the future. But because of this, though, I was also offered another project, a very small project, which is to design a dog sculpture. For those of you, and it's commissioned by, as you probably know, in Hong Kong, they're building a major art museum called the M+, designed by Herzog and de Meuron. And this is sort of commissioned by the museum, but this is obviously not a museum, it's a small sculpture. And I figure, you know, a lot of my friends have told me that, Edwin, you need to get a dog, but then, of course, I will never really walk the dog every day. So this is, I think, an opportunity to have a dog that I don't have to walk, so to speak. So here it is. The idea here is that I figure, you know, of course, for dog sculpture, one of the first things that came to mind is that I don't want the dog to be reminiscent of, say, Jeff Koons, for example. So I'm very conscious of, say, not wanting to make this kind of artistic comparison. So I figure, as opposed to making it very polished, chrome kind of thing, I made this model, prototype of the dog, using kind of little rocks that I found on the street. And I figure I can put the rock on a little golf ball, so it kind of give it a little bit of movement. So this is my first kind of design model for the dog. And then, since then, we're starting to, the dog sculpture project is interesting because it allows me to explore different sort of 3D printing and fabrication techniques. Since I'm no longer able to have the budget to make the kind of building that I used to make, I figure now I can make a dog and do the same thing. So here it is. So this is a dog. So these, we started to make them in different materials and different kind of look. The black dog, it turns out actually is one of my favorite. It actually has an interesting look. And we're in the last stages of kind of production in the sense that I thought that we would make them in different sizes. The small one kind of came about as a kind of accident. Our 3D printer made a mistake and made a small one. It didn't scale right, but we all like the small one. And this is a medium-sized one, which is like the size like about this big. And we thought that we would also make a full-size one, which would be like the size of a dog. And we would probably mill that out of a chunk of walnut, which is something I'm currently interested in. So all the different dogs will have different materials. And we hope that, I'm keeping my fingers crossed, that it could be an interesting exercise. And we're having fun with this. I thought I'd share this with you. And finally, we go to Detroit, which is a project that we have just finished and is getting a lot of attention for some reason. I'm not sure why, but I'll let you be the judge. This is the client. His name is Philip Kafka, and he just turned 31. He's very young and entrepreneurial. I met him in New York at a dinner party, and being a nice guy, we kind of talked at the dinner party, and we kind of bonded. He has a very successful business, despite his age, doing billboards in New York. So, and his company is called Prince Concept because his first billboard right here, it's on Prince Street in Soho. And in any case, so we kind of bonded in New York. I gave him my contact, and that was it. I figure, you know, just making a friend. And then a few weeks later, I got an email from him, and he said, well, he's coming to LA, and he asked me if I had time for coffee. Certainly, I wasn't looking to do concert huts, really, honestly, I don't care. But I figured, okay, I like the guy, we had a good time in New York, so we can have coffee in LA. I figured in 1 hour we'll be done, and then he can move on to his next destination. So he came by my studio, and the 1 hour coffee turned into a 3 hour coffee. And then he was starting to talk about Detroit, where he's starting to invest. And I thought, well, at that time, the LA Arts District, as you also know, just opened the Hauser and Wirth Gallery. And I said to Philip, I said, well, maybe it's interesting for you to go downtown and check out the LA Arts District, because I figured the, art might be an interesting catalyst for the, revitalization, because there are a lot of empty industrial buildings in Detroit. Why not? So the next day I met him in downtown LA. We walked around the art district a little bit. We had more coffee downtown, and then he was all excited about it. And then that was that. And then the next day he said, well, can I come by your office again? So the 1 hour coffee turned into a 3 day of 3 hour, 4 hour coffees. And then we talked about all kinds of stuff. but he never talked about his project. We just talked about things, and I didn't realize that he was interviewing me for 3 days in a row. I was just being myself. In any case, then a few weeks later, he sent me another email, and he said, well, Edwin, do you have a plan to be in the East Coast? And by coincidence, I was going to be in New York in a few weeks, and I told him that, and he said, well, if you're in New York, why don't you come to Detroit, and I want to show you something. And I said, okay, I'll take an extra day, I'll come to Detroit. And then he started to show me what he's got. And it's turned out that in the last few years, he's sort of purchased a series of land at this intersection of Grand River Avenue and Warren. And he told me about the first phase of his development that he wanted to do, which is called True North. And then he has also 5 other acres around this development that he's interested in. He asked me if I would be interested to design True North for him. And then he said, well, but I wanted to make it with Quonset huts. And I must say that when he threw that at me, I had some reservations. And I said, well, but the Quonset hut has been traditionally associated with army barracks and kind of storage buildings. But I thought that it would be an interesting challenge to take it on and to see what you could do to modernize the building type and make it a place that is not like an army barrack, an interesting place. So I sat down with Philip and we sort of established some kind of basic principles of how to organize the site. First of all, we thought, well, a lot of people, when they're asked to build a development, they would put fencing around the site just because of the nature of the security and all these things that you hear about Detroit. And I said, well, to make a community inviting, we should try not to do that. So we try to create it. One of the things that we did is that we thought we would use landscape as a way to make these boundaries and delineate. So we created these zones horizontally that marches back from the main street that start to suggest different areas and different ways so that people have to penetrate this. Out here in the front is a river of rock, so to speak, that makes it a little bit, that creates a little bit of a visual barrier, but not like a fence. And then we kind of created these pathways that penetrates the site into the site like this, and then also paths where the Quonset huts would be located. And then, of course, to locate the Quonset huts onto these paths and organize in a way to kind of encourage public communal spaces. So in the center, there's a big communal space, and there are also these little smaller, more intimate scale spaces. So the site is really organized through these, it's really the outdoor spaces that organize the location of the huts. We thought that also this hut here in the back, if you put it in perfect alignment with this, it would not have as good natural light, so we moved this a little bit to the, we kind of tilted it at an angle, and also this one to optimize the exposure of light and visual accessibility. But other than that, we kept this in sort of basically courtyard organization. And also, and this is kind of what the master plan of the site kind of looks like. And we also want to introduce art, and I think very much about how the site could be animated with art, potentially, and with outdoor activities. So in the center, I'm hoping that we could kind of create a common space, and then there are all these other spaces that could become sites for sculptural installation. This is an image of it. I rather like it in the snow because it kind of makes it blends in with the neighborhood here, you can see. Now, how does one make the Quonset hut not look military, I guess? Our solution is that we wanted to create a lot of varieties. So we've sort of identified together different kind of Quonset hut types. So, for example, each one, by varying the arc, the radius of the hut, but also some are quite high. They have a mezzanine in the middle. A lot of the Quonset huts, we wanted to take advantage of the curvature of the spaces. So we created this concept called the island. In the island is in the plan a way to organize all the utilities so that the hut itself could become much more open. Also in the mix is a 3-story hut. So the downstairs is potentially a 2-story high, double high gallery space with another living unit on top. So you can see that part of this is a lot of this is about variety, varying the height and the volume of the huts. And also the plans are quite different. They vary from like 450 square feet to 1,800 square feet. This is a big hut, designed to have a small office in the front, and then in the back it could be a live work. They're also designed with very specific clienteles in mind. For example, these huts, we call them creative. Potentially it could be a hut for an artist or a designer. Detroit, you probably don't know this, has quite a gastro scene developing. So there are 2 units designed for chefs, the incubating units for chefs. And then there are small units like these for people like myself, micro living. So I'm never home, so I don't need a lot of space. Just tiny space like this is fine. And then there's a little bit more conventional units like these. And then obviously there's a premium unit, this one, the big one. This is the 2-level plans of the 3-story one that I'm talking about. Downstairs, as I said, is an event space that is like a gallery. And then upstairs is a living unit. So this could be an artist in residence. So by mixing the volume and the floor plan that cater towards the different people that could potentially be living there, we're creating a lot of varieties that could offset the monotony and the repetition of the kind of army barrack look. These are just some 3-dimensional images of how the huts would be. And also, light is very important for the spaces. So the huts, we have these kind of translucent ends so that allow a lot of natural light to go into the interior of the huts. Now, to construct the huts, it's actually quite amazing. So the huts come like this kind of prepackaged ribs like this. And these ribs could be handled just by 2 people, and this is just a forklift could put together a hut. So basically, the exterior enclosure for the hut could be erected by 2 to 3 days. And this is, again, Philip with his construction crew. And once the rib is enclosed, we can clad the hut in a variety of different ways to create the insulation and also the waterproofing. So inside the huts, we have a trellis like this, and on top of the trellis is drywall or plywood or some kind of finish that creates the insulation and the interior look. Of course, all the huts will have a radiant floor so that in the cold winters of Detroit, the huts will become warm. And these are just some images of the finish of the interior, like they're clad in plywood, and you can see some of these islands that are used with the sleeping loft on top. And you could see the end walls, the polycarbonate panels allow the interior to have privacy, but at the same time letting a lot of natural light flood the interior. Last week, we have just received this curb video, which is the closest thing that I could then to bring you to see the huts. So now let's play the video.
I think a lot of people were skeptical at first because they had never seen the interior of a hut, but once you do, you see the vision a little bit more.
Before this, I was hopping around cafes, doing my work there. So it's nice to have like a place that's really inspiring. You can keep your doors open and kind of let the outside world in.
just stoked to collaborate with each other. It's a really, really weird but unique and cool thing.
And it's a totally different lifestyle for everyone here. So it forms a nice connection and bond between all of us.
I think what is amazing about working on this project, the whole development we were able to achieve for $850,000 for the whole thing, which is, I think, incredible value for Philip and for the project. And also, we designed and constructed the whole thing pretty much in a little bit over a year. So it happened in a very fast pace. And in LA, for example, I'm working on a house, a residential project, and the house is in plan check longer than the time it took to design and build this whole project. So I enjoy very much the experience of working in Detroit. It came about, as I mentioned to you, as a surprise, but it's been incredibly rewarding. And I think that Detroit is a very special place. It has a very special energy, and I'm very grateful that I had the opportunity to have worked on this project. And I think it's interesting also the video ended with the idea that this is a project that supports a collaboration, which is a very important part of my practice. So, and I wanted to say that obviously everything that I've done is collaborative, and I wouldn't have been able to realize any of this without my very small office. And I want to thank them for their faith in me and for staying with me as a startup, and hopefully we can grow together in the future. And thank you for bearing with me tonight.